You wake up. It's dark. The kind of dark that would make a flashlight cry. There's no hum of traffic, no buzz from a fridge, no distant TV chatter, just the sounds of livestock occasionally snoring outside your one-room cottage. Yes, even the chickens are getting better sleep than you. You sit up slowly on your scratchy straw-stuffed mattress. A rat scurries nearby. Not because it's scared of you, just because it has errands to run. Maybe you have to pee. Maybe you just jolted awake from a nightmare about being accused of witchcraft. Again. Or maybe, and here's the fun part, you're wide awake at 1:30 a.m. because that's just what people did for hundreds of years. Welcome to pre-industrial Europe, where waking up at midnight wasn't just normal, it was part of the plan. You see, before the 18th century and the invention of that magical electric switch that lets us pretend the sun never left, people didn't sleep all the way through the night. No, that would be too convenient. Instead, they had what we call segmented sleep. Or, as I like to think of it, Sleep 1.0, beta version, bugs included. You'd go to bed sometime after sunset, which in winter meant, let's say around 7 p.m. Because there was nothing else to do. No TikTok, no podcasts, just you, the fire, and the looming existential dread of surviving another day with a 32-year life expectancy. So you'd crawl into your blanket, more like a scratchy burlap shroud soaked in smoke and despair, and drift off. Then, sometime after midnight, like clockwork, you'd wake up. Not because you were anxious or insomniac. That was the normal rhythm. 2 sleeps, with a 1 to 2 hour waking period in between, casually called the watch or the waking. During this time, you might say a prayer, check the livestock, stoke the fire, or, if you're feeling frisky, commit the sin of marital congress under a roof made of mildew and regrets. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always oddly fascinating to see who's out there in the world, hopefully not suffering through a 2-part sleep schedule like this poor peasant version of you. All right, let's dig in, shall we? Let's say it's 1324. You're in rural England. You have a name, but no one bothers to remember it, because surnames haven't really caught on yet unless you're nobility or that one guy everyone calls John the Fish Smeller. You're 28 years old, which, by medieval standards, makes you a grizzled veteran of life. You've lost 3 siblings to plague, 1 to a donkey accident, and you probably have rickets. Sleep is supposed to be your reward for surviving the day. But instead, you get this. 7 p.m. to midnight, wake up, stumble around. Then 2 a.m. to sunrise routine. Now, let's pause here. If this sounds like madness to you, congratulations. You're the product of the Industrial Revolution. That magical era when someone said, hey, what if we ruined the natural human sleep cycle and invent child labor at the same time? Prior to that, this biphasic sleep thing was everywhere. From medieval monks to French peasants to Roman philosophers, people documented the same pattern. It was so normal that they didn't even call it weird. Just first sleep and second sleep. Like software patches for your dreams. The first sleep typically started shortly after dusk. Your room was pitch black because candles were expensive and no one wanted to burn the house down with one sneeze. The bed, if you were lucky enough to have one, was shared by spouses, children, the dog, and maybe a few fleas with names. It was a cozy, crowded affair. Privacy? Not a thing. Your neighbors probably heard your nighttime activities, including the part where you whispered about how nice it would be to own 2 chickens one day. After about 4 or 5 hours, your eyes would pop open. No, not because your iPhone alarm went off. You just woke up. Naturally. It was like your brain got bored and decided it was time for a break. What did people do during this midnight limbo? Well, the sources say a little of everything. Praying. Contemplating. Milling grain. Visiting neighbors. Yes, imagine just strolling over to the cottage next door at 2 a.m. to borrow a turnip. Completely normal. Some people use this time for intimacy because, according to a few medieval medical texts, this was considered the best time to do the deed. Why? Because you were well rested, relaxed, and, quite literally, between dreams. Romantic? No. Your breath smells like onion and fermented barley. But hey, no one's brushing their teeth anyway. Others just sat by the fire and thought. A sort of natural meditation period. Quiet. Dark. You could reflect on your life, or the fact that your cow might not make it through the winter, or that the lord of the manor keeps raising the grain tax, and you may soon be legally obligated to starve. Sometimes you read, if you were one of the 5 literate people in the village and also rich enough to own a candle. But mostly, you sat, or did light chores, or stared at the fire like a character in a BBC historical drama. And then, like a well-trained squirrel, your body would start winding down again around 2 or 3 a.m. You'd crawl back into bed. Second sleep would take you until sunrise. Then it was time to get up. For real. Because the chickens were screaming. Now, if you're wondering why this bizarre sleep schedule disappeared, blame Thomas Edison. Sort of. The Industrial Revolution didn't just give us pollution and factories and Dickensian child suffering. It also gave us artificial light. Suddenly, you didn't have to go to bed with the sun. You could push bedtime back, which meant people started skipping first sleep altogether and just zonking out once, hopefully, until morning. Add to that the modern work schedule, 9 to 5 jobs, alarm clocks, the ever-present anxiety of late-stage capitalism, and you've got a recipe for insomnia. People still wake up at 2 or 3 a.m., by the way. That's the part of our brains that hasn't caught up yet. But now we call it a sleep disorder instead of, Tuesday. And let's talk about the experience of sleeping in the medieval era. It was nothing like your memory foam luxury cocoon of today. Your mattress was a sack of straw that needed regular beating to avoid mold, fleas, and the slow rot of your hopes and dreams. Sheets were rare. Blankets were heavy wool. Too hot in summer, never quite warm enough in winter. And pillows? Please. You stuffed your cloak under your head and called it innovation. Even the concept of bedrooms was foreign. Most peasants slept in the same room they cooked in. In fact, the bed was often the only piece of furniture. Your in-laws, 3 kids, and that one neighbor who never leaves might all be within 5 feet of you. Cozy, in a we're all definitely getting the same flu kind of way. But let's not forget the sounds. No insulation. Thin walls. Roosters crowing long before dawn. Pigs squealing. Church bells. Drunks stumbling home. The occasional witch trial. Every noise was either a warning, a celebration, or your cue to lie completely still and pretend to be asleep so you wouldn't get roped into something terrible. And yet, despite all this, people slept. Not because they had better sleep hygiene, but because there were no options. You were physically exhausted from a day of farming, walking, hauling, or just existing without modern medicine. You weren't doom-scrolling Twitter or binge-watching 6 hours of medieval crime documentaries. You didn't have an espresso machine, or deadlines, or 401ks. You had barley, bread, back pain, and bedtime. Interestingly, the church tried to regulate this midnight waking period. Some monasteries scheduled prayers during this time, turning a natural biological event into a sacred ritual. Because why wouldn't you wake up and recite psalms at 2 a.m.? Nothing says devotion like chanting while half asleep with a rat in your boot. And that brings us to the psychological element. Some researchers argue that this segmented sleep pattern actually aligns more closely with human circadian rhythms, meaning we've basically been gaslighting ourselves for the last 300 years with our solid 8 hours or else mentality. But back in 1324, no one cared about optimal sleep cycles. You just did what your parents did and what theirs did before them. Sleep. Wake. Think. Sleep again. Then start the day, hoping you wouldn't be crushed by a cart or burned as a heretic. So as you lie there in your soft, clean bed, yes, I'm talking to you, the one listening to this trying to fall asleep, remember this, if you wake up at 2 a.m., you're not broken. You're just living like a medieval peasant, but with better hygiene. Probably. And don't worry, you'll drift back to sleep soon enough. After all, it's just your first sleep ending. You've got a second one coming. Just like they did in the year 1324. Only now, you don't have to check on livestock or fear the wrath of an angry baron. Just your inbox. And maybe your cat. Alright, I'll stop talking. For now. But don't get too comfortable. In the next chapter, we're going to dig into what really went on during those midnight waking hours, and trust me, it wasn't all prayers and snuggling. You're awake again. Still 1324. Still in your scratchy wool nightshirt. still lying on what amounts to a sentient pile of hay and regret. It's about 1:37 a.m., and the fire's nearly out. You can see your breath fog in the dark. There's a slight smell of smoke, wet socks, and possibly fermented onions. That's either your breath or the dying embers, hard to tell. Either way, it's time for the watch. No, not the fun kind of watch. There's no Netflix, no true crime podcasts, not even a poorly written medieval romance novel to skim. You can't text your ex or doom scroll through Instagram. You wake up and do stuff. Quiet, shadowy, sleepy-eyed, mildly depressing stuff. Let's start with the obvious. You're not alone. Most people in your village are probably up to. This was a shared cultural rhythm, like a sad flash mob in the middle of the night. It's dark, it's cold, and it's socially acceptable to wander around like a zombie for about an hour or two. You might throw on a cloak, if you're fancy, and head outside to get some air, which really means checking the chickens or peeing behind the same tree everyone else uses. The air is brisk. The stars are the brightest thing you've seen since last summer. And your bare feet are now fully aware of how much you regret that decision. Inside, someone else in the house is up too. It might be your spouse, or your eldest child, or that mysterious uncle who claims he once met the Pope. They're probably sitting by the hearth, mumbling a prayer, or poking at the coals with a stick that doubles as a stirring spoon, walking stick, and disciplinary tool. So what do you do at 2 a.m. in 1324? Well, let's go down the list. 1. You pray. This is the most documented midnight activity, thanks to medieval monks writing everything down like unpaid interns for God. Midnight prayers, known as matins, were a big deal in monasteries. Imagine being forcibly woken up to sing cold, nasal chants in Latin while wearing a robe and thinking about sin. That's religion in the 14th century. For the average peasant, though, this was more like a quiet moment to recite familiar prayers. Maybe for protection. Maybe for forgiveness. Maybe because it was the only time the house was remotely quiet. Also, people were terrified of nighttime demons. Like, genuinely worried that failing to mutter the right combination of words would invite spiritual doom. This was before sleep paralysis had a scientific explanation. Back then, if you woke up and couldn't move, obviously it was because a demon was sitting on your chest. Probably named Walter. He means well. 2. You think. A lot. This is where things get weirdly relatable. Some historians, like Roger Kirch, the guy who basically revived the entire segmented sleep theory, found tons of old documents describing how people used this quiet midnight time to think deeply. Reflect. Contemplate. You know, the sort of mental spiral you do at 3 a.m. while staring at the ceiling fan. Only they didn't have ceiling fans. They had thatch. And occasional spiders. People used this time to mentally replay conversations, plan their week, worry about the harvest, or dwell on theological dread. Were you going to hell? Was your cow sick because of a curse? Could the moon be angry with you? The usual. Some even described a feeling of serenity during this time. Peaceful stillness. Kind of like a brain-powered bubble bath. Until you remember your cousin died last week from stepping on a rusty nail, and maybe you're next. 3. You talk. Conversation was a big one. Married couples might spend this time talking. Not about anything exciting. Just a medieval version of pillow talk. Did you hear Marjorie's pig escaped again? Or do you think the Lord's tax collector is secretly a warlock? You know, intimate stuff. In a world where people work from sunrise to sunset just to not die, the middle of the night might be the only chance for casual dialogue. No distractions. Just you and someone you tolerate enough to share a bed with. Maybe you even laugh a little, or sigh deeply about how many turnips you'll need to trade for new boots. 4. You have sex. Let's be real, this was prime time for intimacy. A lot of medieval medical guides suggested that nighttime, specifically the hour between first and second sleep, was optimal for getting frisky. The logic? You were rested from the first sleep, but not yet bogged down by the misery of daylight. It's like a grim little romantic comedy set inside a hay-filled room with your 4 children asleep in the corner. There are even court records, weirdly enough, that confirm this. Cases of illicit affairs often mentioned late-night visits between first and second sleep. Adultery was practically a scheduled event. Get up, sneak out. Sin, sneak back in. Burn in hell later. 5. You do chores. Yes, chores. Some people use this time to prep food, sweep floors, or tend to animals. Particularly in farming households, this hour or two was a quiet chance to do small tasks before the chaos of sunrise. Things like kneading dough, checking on sick animals, or fixing a broken tool. It wasn't considered strange. You just did what needed doing, especially in the winter when the days were too short to get everything done in the sunlight. You didn't need a planner or a morning routine vlog. You just got up and swept out the soot, because no one else was going to do it and your goat's giving you side-eye. 6. You visit people. Yes. In the dark. This part shocks modern sensibilities. It wasn't unusual for people to visit neighbors or wander outside during the watch. With moonlight, your eyes adjusted enough to get around, and villages were small. You might walk 2 cottages over to share news or borrow firewood. Because if you think today's humans are chatty, medieval ones were worse. There were no phones. If you had a thought, you said it. Out loud. At 2 a.m. Some towns even had taverns open in the wee hours for travelers or restless souls. Imagine being served cold ale by candlelight while discussing plague rumors. You hear old Greg got a boil on his neck? That's usually the start. And remember, the idea that night was a time for danger and isolation was largely a modern construct. In pre-industrial times, night had its own rhythms and rituals. Sure, wolves and bandits existed, but so did night markets, nocturnal festivals, and midnight marriages. Yes, that was a thing. Midnight weddings. Because why not combine your 2 worst habits, sleep deprivation and questionable life decisions? 7. You try to sleep again. Eventually, your body starts to feel heavy. The fire is low. You've run out of things to worry about. Or at least, you've pushed them far enough back that your brain will let you rest. You crawl back into the warm, slightly damp bed. The mattress groans beneath your weight. Not because it's old, though it is, but because it's full of straw, sticks, and the crushed dreams of every peasant before you. Second sleep begins. And this one's usually deeper, longer, filled with more vivid dreams. Some people even claim that first sleep dreams were practical, mundane stuff like lost objects or daily anxieties. But second sleep dreams were more surreal. Mystical. Spooky. Maybe you dream of flying. Or of being burned as a heretic. Again. Classic medieval vibes. By the time the rooster crows, your 2-part slumber is done. You've had a full night's rest. 6, maybe 7 hours total. Broken up, yes, but fully aligned with your body's natural rhythm. You wake up groggy but functional, ready for another day of medieval existence, plowing fields, avoiding boils, and remembering which mushrooms are edible. Here's the kicker. Some researchers today are revisiting this old pattern. There's evidence that a segmented sleep schedule might actually reduce stress, improve memory, and allow for more creativity. But try telling your boss you're napping at 8 p.m. so you can have a divine second sleep at 3 a.m. and see how that goes. So the next time you're up in the middle of the night, unable to fall back asleep, maybe don't panic. Maybe just imagine yourself in 1324, sitting by a fire, whispering to your spies about Marjorie's pig, and waiting for second sleep to wrap its heavy cloak around you again. Still awake? That's okay. Because in the next chapter, we'll talk about how social class changed your entire sleep experience. From noble 4-poster beds to literally sleeping in the dirt with goats, we're diving into the medieval mattress wars. Spoiler alert, wealth buys you sheets and silence. You wake up again. Not because you're done sleeping. Oh no, second sleep's just barely begun. You wake up because the goat stepped on your face. Again. This is the 3rd time this week. You really need to have a talk with that goat. Or at least move its hooves when it lies down for the night. Congratulations. You live in the bottom third of the medieval social hierarchy, which means your bedroom isn't really a bedroom. It's more like a shared barn cellar bedroom pantry hopes and dreams graveyard. There are 9 people in this room. None of them have bathed in a week. The floor is made of packed dirt. There's a wet corner no one talks about. Someone's baby is crying. Someone else is farting in their sleep. Your blanket is more holes than cloth. But hey, at least you're not a serf in winter. Let's talk about sleeping arrangements and how profoundly they varied depending on whether you were a noble, a middling sort, or a human scarecrow with a name like Alfred Turnipbiter. Because no, medieval people didn't all sleep the same. Your sleep space told the world everything about you, how much money you had, how many candles you could afford, and whether or not rats considered your bed a viable breeding ground. Let's begin at the bottom, where most people lived, and climb the stinky ladder from there. Peasants, dirt floors, and goat snores. If you're a peasant, and statistically, your sleeping situation is best described as communal suffering. You likely live in a one-room house. 2. If you're thriving. The walls are wattle and daub, which is a fancy way of saying sticks and mud pretending to be architecture. There's a single hearth for cooking, heating, and, occasionally, crying. You sleep with your family, all on the same floor, often beside livestock. Not because you like cuddling sheep, but because body heat is your best defense against frostbite and death. Chickens, dogs, goats, toddlers. It's a slumber party. If the party theme is grinding poverty and respiratory illness. Your mattress, such as it is stuffed with straw. Not the clean kind. This is reused straw. Straw that has seen things. Some families slept on sacks filled with chaff or old rushes. These sacks were rarely cleaned and often attracted lice, fleas, and the occasional sentient beetle who paid no rent but stayed anyway. Your blanket? Woven wool. Thick, itchy, slightly damp. It smells like a wet sweater after a nervous breakdown. And you share it. Because firewood is expensive and there's no central heating. You want to be warm? Snuggle your cousin. That's just how things work now. There's no pillow. You use your own arm. If you're fancy, maybe a bundled-up cloak or a bag of grain. Or a turnip. The turnip is cold but emotionally supportive. This is where you sleep every night. First sleep, midnight watch, second sleep. The same space every time. There's no privacy. Your entire family knows when you fart, dream, or whisper to yourself about building a better life. That dream dies the moment the rooster crows. Townsfolk, slightly fewer rodents. If you're a townsperson, a baker, blacksmith, or coopersmith's second cousin, congratulations, you might have an upstairs. This alone makes you royalty in peasant terms. Your sleeping space is marginally more dignified. There's still straw, but it's in a wooden bed frame now. Maybe you have a feather bed. It's not fluffy. It's lumpy. Like sleeping on a potato sack filled with angry birds. The mattress sits on ropes or wooden slats. Over time, the ropes sag. So you have to tighten your bed, which is where that phrase comes from. Yes, really. That's the most wholesome historical fact in this chapter. Enjoy it. It only gets grosser from here. You might sleep with your spies, children, apprentice, and possibly your cousin visiting from a nearby hamlet. Again, sleeping arrangements were less about personal space and more about not dying from cold, loneliness, or superstition. Chambers were often dark and smoky. Candles were expensive. So you didn't light one unless you absolutely needed it. The smell of the room? Imagine old sweat, boiled cabbage, mildew, and a faint hint of despair. That's your nose's medieval mixtape. Your bedding might include a coverlet or sheepskin. If you're well off, you might have sheets. Linen, if you're lucky. Stiff, scratchy, and washed only when there's more bacteria than fiber. There's also a chamber pot. It lives under your bed. It smells like regret. You use it when it's too cold to go outside. But if you're a servant, you empty it. That's your job now. Nobles, decadents, and drafts. Now let's take a dream walk up the social ladder. You're a noble, a knight, a lord, or, at the very least, someone with an obnoxiously long name that includes of in a castle no one can pronounce. You sleep in a chamber. Not a room. A chamber. It might be in a stone manor or a drafty castle tower. And yes, it's still cold. Because stone holds heat like a broken relationship. But your bed? Oh, your bed is a monument. A giant wooden frame carved with symbols, topped with a canopy, surrounded by thick curtains that serve the dual purpose of blocking drafts and hiding your shame. The mattress is a feather bed. Sort of. It's stuffed with whatever dead birds your servants could find and shove in a sack. You probably don't care. You haven't made your own bed since age 7. The sheets are linen, dyed with herbs to repel lice and add a faint scent of lavender, wormwood, or rose. They haven't been changed in weeks. That's the maid's problem. Your blanket is fur, wolf, bear, or something equally dramatic. And unlike peasants, you don't share your bed with your whole family. Just your spouse. And possibly your lover. And the dog. Sometimes a servant, if they're on watch. or the occasional guest who had too much mead and passed out next to you. Medieval boundaries were fluid. Also, nobles didn't necessarily sleep alone in their rooms. Often, servants slept nearby, either in the same room or just outside the door, ready to fetch water, wine, or warm rocks to tuck in your bed. This was a power move. Nothing says wealth like a teenager whose entire job is to carry your hot rock. The room is lit by candlelight or oil lamps. There's a tapestry on the wall, mostly to stop wind from whistling through the stones. The fire crackles. Your sleep is still broken into 2 shifts, but now you can enjoy your midnight watch with a glass of wine and a muttered complaint about the serfs. You're probably still cold. You probably still get lice. But at least your mattress doesn't have hooves. Monks and nuns, celibate sleep and chilly chants. Let's not forget our beloved celibate overachievers, monks and nuns. Their sleep schedule was the strictest of all. In a monastery, you sleep in a dormitory. A long room lined with simple wooden beds or pallets. Everything is austere. Your mattress is straw. Your pillow is humility. Your blanket is God's disappointment. Sleep begins early, maybe 8 or 9 p.m. But you don't get a full night. Oh no. You're woken up before midnight for matins, a prayer service designed to make sure no one ever enjoys REM sleep. You stumble into the chapel in your robe, half frozen, chanting Latin you memorized during your novitiate. It echoes in the stone like a Gregorian ringtone from hell. Then you stumble back to bed for second sleep. Wake again at dawn. Repeat. Monastic sleep was regulated, disciplined, and frankly designed to suppress joy. But hey, you're not lusting. So it's working. Travelers, pray for a dry corner. And if you're a traveler, too poor for an inn, too tired to walk, your sleeping arrangements are unpredictable and deeply unsettling. Maybe you crash at a church. Maybe a farmer lets you stay in their stable. Maybe you curl up under a tree and pray the wolves had dinner already. There are no sleeping bags. No dry socks. No Starbucks. Just you, the night, and the distant howling of what might be a hungry fox or your own imagination. So yes, where you slept in the Middle Ages wasn't just about comfort. It was a declaration of status, survival, and sheer luck. From dirt floors to feather beds, from goat snores to canopy curtains, sleep was never just sleek. It was an immersive, textured, often uncomfortable part of your identity. And despite all this, despite the lice, the cold, the crowding, the goat in your bed, you still woke up, yawned, and got on with your medieval life. You ate your barley mush, you feared God, and you braced for plague. Still awake. Good. Because next, we'll unravel how they actually fell asleep without blackout curtains, ASMR, or melatonin gummies. Spoiler alert, poppy seeds and superstition are involved. You're lying on your straw mattress, which is definitely hosting a family of fleas and a medium-sized spider with boundary issues. The fire is down to embers. The room is pitch black. Your blanket smells faintly of sheep and something that might be mold or sorrow. You're tired. You work 12 hours digging mud for the local lord's cabbage trench. And yet, sleep evades you. Because you, dear medieval human, have no melatonin, no white noise machine, no bedtime yoga app called Serenity Stoat, and no TikTok rabbit hole to doom scroll until 3 a.m. So, how exactly did you fall asleep? Let's take a slow, snoozy walk through the medieval bedtime routine, which, depending on your class, religion, and level of pest infestation, might range from surprisingly soothing to deeply superstitious to absolutely baffling. Spoiler alert, there are no lavender candles. There are dried badger parts. And chanting. Lots of chanting. First of all, let's establish the obvious. Medieval people were exhausted. Not I worked overtime and forgot to drink water exhausted. We're talking I spent the entire day threshing wheat with a tool that hates me and ate nothing but gruel exhausted. Most peasants burned 3,000 to 4,000 calories a day. That's what happens when your entire life is manual labor, uphill, both ways, in shoes made from pigskin and emotional trauma. So yes, when they went to bed, they were ready to pass out. But sleep didn't just happen. It was a process, a ritual, sometimes even a performance. Let's begin where all human experiences start, with fear, bedtime prayers, and superstition. You don't just crawl into bed. You prepare. You have to say your prayers. Not just because you're devout, you are, or at least pretending to be. Heresy gets you very dead, very fast, but because sleep is dangerous. Remember, this is a world where people genuinely believe demons might show up in the night, possess your body, or steal your soul through your open mouth. Nightmares weren't just dreams, they were spiritual threats. So, you pray hard. God bless me, protect me, keep me from night-wandering spirits, goblins, succubi, and whatever else the neighbor swore he saw in the forest last week. Many people recited a version of the "Now I lay me down to sleep" prayer. Except back then, it was scarier and had more mentions of dying before waking. For comfort. You might also recite psalms, especially Psalm 91, which medieval people believed warded off evil. If you were really into nighttime safety, you'd carve protective symbols into your bed frame, hang herbs over the door, or sleep with a dagger under your pillow in case Satan came by for tea. Sweet dreams. Herbs, potions, and natural sleep aids. Let's say you're still not sleepy. Maybe the rats are restless. Maybe the baby next to you is teething. Maybe your joints hurt from living in the 14th century. Time to reach for a remedy. Medieval people had plenty of options for natural sleep aids. Unfortunately, most of them were about as safe as a punch to the kidney. Common ingredients included poppy seeds, mild sedative, but also mildly toxic if overused. Used in sleep pillows and teas. Mandrake root, strong sedative, often used in spells. Also hallucinogenic. Also potentially lethal. So, fun. Valerian, used in teas or tucked into pillows. Actually effective. Smells like feet. Hops, yes, the same thing used to make beer. Stuffed into sleep pillows or made into relaxing drafts. Henbane and nightshade, used very carefully by people who had a death wish or a lot of trial and error time. These herbs were dried, boiled, made into poultices, or stuffed into sleep pillows, little cloth bundles you placed near your head to inhale the scent. Think of it as a medieval aromatherapy diffuser, but one that sometimes made you hallucinate goats. A particularly famous medieval remedy involved soaking lettuce in hot water and drinking the liquid. Congratulations! You've just made the world's first disappointing salad tea. Alcohol, the original sleep aid. Of course, the most popular sleep aid was, and still is, booze. Beer was the drink of the masses. Wine, if you were rich or French. Ale was consumed all day long, even by children, because water was often unsafe to drink unless boiled. A good mug of ale before bed? That knocked most people out. And if it didn't, drink two. It wasn't considered alcoholism if you were also being slowly poisoned by your water supply. But here's the thing, medieval ale wasn't like today's beer. It was often flat, warm, and sometimes had bits of bread floating in it. So basically, soup. Cheers. Mental preparation. How to unwind in the year 1327. Okay, so you've prayed, you've sipped your lettuce juice or your turnip wine, and you've exorcised the bedroom, just to be safe. What do you do while waiting to fall asleep? If you're a peasant, nothing. You're unconscious the second your face hits the straw. But if you're a monk, noble, or townsperson, you might ease into sleep with some good, clean thinking. No books. Most people couldn't read, and books were rare and handwritten by angry monks who hated margins. Instead, people would mentally recite memorized stories, psalms, or moral lessons. If you're a noble, maybe you reflect on the day's hunting, or remember that one time you jousted Sir Gawain and almost died but looked excellent doing it. In bed with your spouse, you might whisper. Talk about dreams, hopes, the latest gossip about Brother Elric, who totally fell asleep during Vespers again. This is where relationships happened. This little wakeful period, between first and second sleep, was often the only quiet moment of the day. A pause. A chance to think, pray, whisper, or wonder how you'll survive the next plague outbreak. And finally, sleep overtakes you. The sounds of a medieval night. But just because you're asleep doesn't mean the world stops. Far from it. Let's listen to the ambient soundscape of your typical medieval night. Outside your window, if you have one. Barking dogs. Owls hooting ominously. Wind whistling through a roof with more holes than actual roof. A drunk guy shouting a hymn off-key while trying to find his house. The clatter of hooves if someone's traveling by night. Foxes screaming. Yes, screaming. If you've never heard it, it's concerning. Inside your room. Snoring. Epic, industrial-strength snoring. Children coughing. Someone sleep-talking in Latin. A rat chewing on something. Hopefully not your boot. The soft, rhythmic creak of a bed from someone's midnight productivity, if you catch my drift. But eventually, all of this fades into the background. You sink into second sleep, blissfully unaware of lice, debt, and the fact that your town's water supply is about to be cursed by a traveling magician. Sleep. Real sleep. Deep, dreamless, unbothered. At least for a few hours. So yes, medieval people did fall asleep. Not with spa music or ASMR whisperers, but with exhaustion, prayer, poppy seed tea, and the occasional spiritual panic attack. Still, they found a rhythm, a routine, and between first sleep, midnight watch, and second sleep, they built a kind of balance, one that let them survive plague, poverty, and pitch-black nights filled with owls and questionable cheese. You wake up, but not because your alarm went off. There's no alarm, no snooze button. No cursed iPhone screen glowing in your face like the Eye of Sauron. You simply wake. It's the middle of the night. Pitch black. Somewhere between definitely still dark and rooster hasn't even considered crowing yet. But here's the strange part. You don't feel groggy. You're not confused or annoyed. You're not wondering why you're awake. You're supposed to be. This is normal. This is the midnight gap. The sacred pause. The blessed in-between. The most overlooked part of the medieval sleep cycle, an hour or two of calm wakefulness right in the middle of the night. And you're about to live it. This middle-of-the-night wake-up wasn't a mistake. It wasn't insomnia. It was a built-in feature of the medieval body clock. First sleep carried you from dusk until somewhere around midnight. Then your brain naturally eased you awake, not sharply, but softly. Like it was gently tapping you on the shoulder and saying, "Hey, you've got some time. Do what you like." This interlude lasted about an hour or two. Long enough to be noticeable. Long enough to do something. But not long enough to call it morning. And the world was designed around it. So, what did medieval people do during this in-between phase? Let's begin with the obvious. They got it on. Yes, let's not be coy. One of the most well-documented uses of the time between first and second sleep was marital collaboration. Conjugal coordination. Nighttime nudity negotiations. Doctors, monks, and moralists all noted that people frequently used this midnight window for what they called physical union. Often followed by prayer. Sometimes followed by another nap. Occasionally followed by immediate regret and confession. Why then? Because people weren't exhausted. After a few hours of sleep, they were well rested enough to function, but not yet alert enough to do anything that involved sharp objects. Perfect timing. Some physicians even recommended this timing as the most fertile and healthy. Because of course they did. Nothing says romance like medical advice from a guy who thinks leeches cure sadness. If you weren't, busy, there were other options. You might read, if you could. Though books were rare, religious folks, monks, priests, particularly wealthy people, might use the gap to read scripture or copy text by candlelight. You might pray. In fact, this period was considered spiritually powerful. Deep night was prime time for holy contemplation. Quiet, dark, sacred. Some monks were scheduled to wake up deliberately at this hour to sing the matins or nocturnes, night prayers. Bells would toll. Robes would rustle. Cold feet would hit freezing stone floors. All for the glory of God. So if you were particularly devout, you might wake up to chant some Latin, reflect on mortality, and then crawl back under the sheepskin to try again. But for most common folk, the midnight gap was used for something simpler. Thinking. Real, honest, human thinking. This was your time. No chores. No shouting. No lords or priests or markets. You lay there, staring into the wooden beams above your bed, thinking about life. About death. About whether you'd survive winter. About whether you could finally fix that hole in the roof before it collapsed. About the weird dream you just had where your goat turned into your cousin and started arguing with the bishop. It was quiet, peaceful, introspective. This gap allowed people to process the day, to plan, to dream, not in the REM sleep way, but in the life-pondering way. And some historians believe this was good for the brain. Healthy, even. It gave people time to regulate emotions, sort memories, and build mental resilience in a world where the average day included famine, violence, and stew. But what about work? Yes. Because sometimes, this gap wasn't entirely restful. If you were a servant or a baker, the midnight gap might mean it's time to start the ovens. Bakers often began work around midnight, or 1 a.m. bread had to be ready by dawn. And bread, in medieval society, was life. Literally. So, while most people were lying in semi-conscious contemplation, bakers were elbow-deep in dough, cursing yeast and life. Servants, too, might start preparing fires, cleaning, fetching water, or tending to chamber pots, yes, the portable toilets of the time. Welcome to luxury living. If you were a miller and there was a stream running your wheel, you might get up to check the grind. Farmers sometimes checked on animals. So, while the idea of the midnight gap was spiritual and calm, the reality often included chores, dairy management, and the gentle scraping of someone cleaning soot off a cooking pot in total darkness. Let's not forget the weird stuff. Because if ever there were a time to get a little weird, it was this. Superstitions about midnight ran deep. The night was full of meaning, but also of fear. The dead were thought to walk during these hours. Ghosts, demons, witches, even elves and fairies might be active in the quiet hours between sleeps. If you saw someone out walking at this time, especially alone, you had questions. Big questions. Were they cursed? Possessed? French? People sometimes got up to perform rituals, warding spells, herbal blessings, candle magic. Especially if you had trouble falling back into second sleep. Yes, medieval people had sleep anxiety, too. And their solution was usually either herbal incense or a quick incantation to Saint Dymphna. And then, second sleep. Eventually, the edge comes off your wakefulness. The embers glow gently. You're warm, even though the room has dropped to outside fridge temperatures. The dog by your feet lets out a satisfied grunt. You roll over, pull the blanket up, and you slip, gently, slowly, back into your second sleep. This second round was often deeper. Dream-heavy. In fact, historians think that most vivid dreams happen during second sleep, not the first. Why? Because your body had already done its basic recharge. Your brain was now cleaning out the emotional trash bin. You might dream of angels, of war, of falling down a hole full of eels and shouting monks. Some people even believed you could receive divine messages during this time. Visions, warnings, occasionally romantic visits from saints, which, yes, made confession the next morning very awkward. But somewhere around dawn, the birds start making horrible noises again. Roosters, sparrows, something with too many wings and an agenda. The sun creeps in through the shutters, or if you're poor, through the wall, because there's no window, just hope. And you wake again. For real this time. You feel okay. Not refreshed exactly, but not destroyed. You had your 2 sleeps, your sacred pause, your brief moment of midnight peace. Time to start another day of mud, bread, and surviving the 14th century without antibiotics. Good luck out there. And so, this odd, ancient rhythm, first sleep, midnight wakefulness, second sleep, formed the heartbeat of pre-industrial life. A sleep pattern built not by alarms, but by the sun. Not by social media, but by cows and candles. And while we've long forgotten this way of sleeping, flattened it into one big block of 8 hours and branded it as normal, the body remembers. Even now, if you wake up at 2 a.m. for no reason, you're not broken. You're medieval. You wake up again, but this time, something's wrong. There's a loud clanking noise. It sounds suspiciously like gears grinding against other gears that do not want to be ground. You open your eyes. You're not in your cozy, flea-infested straw bed anymore. You're in a factory. A 19th century textile mill, to be exact. There's steam. There's soot. There's a man with a mustache yelling something about productivity. And just like that, your second sleep is dead. Yes. Welcome to the Industrial Revolution. The historical event that gave us railroads, soot-covered children, and, most tragically, the single consolidated sleep cycle. Because nothing kills a natural sleep rhythm faster than capitalism. Let's rewind. For most of human history, people lived by the rhythms of nature. Light dictated life. When the sun went down, you lit a candle or a fire, but only if you were rich enough to afford wax or wood. Darkness was a signal, a cue. The world went quiet. You had your first sleep, your sacred little midnight interlude, your second sleep. Maybe you dreamed of saints. Maybe you dreamed of drowning in ale. Either way, it worked. But then, we invented machines. We invented artificial light. We invented the idea that humans should be awake for exactly 16 hours, sleep for exactly 8, and never, ever listen to their body again. It started small. First, we got street lamps. Then gas lighting in homes. By the early 1800s, you could stay up past sunset and actually see what you were doing. Revolutionary. And with that light came productivity. Factories could run later. Workers could work longer. Shops stayed open. Printing presses printed newspapers deep into the night. You weren't bound to the sun anymore, but you were bound to the clock. Let's talk about the clock. Before the Industrial Revolution, time was kind of suggestion. Villages used sundials, bells, and vague vibes. Morning meant when the rooster shouts. Evening meant when it's too dark to see your own feet. But now, you have a shift. Your shift starts at 6 a.m. sharp. Ends at 6 p.m. If you're late, you're dock pay. If you're late twice, you're fired. Welcome to modern time discipline. No more waking naturally. No more midnight musings. Just a brutally efficient schedule that ignores how your body actually works. And what happened to the 2 sleeps? Gone. Erased. Compressed into one long, uninterrupted chunk because your boss needs you alert by 6 a.m. Even if your body wakes up at midnight, your brain says, go back to sleep. You only get one chance. It's like trying to watch a 3-hour movie in one sitting, but your eyes keep closing halfway through, and Netflix keeps asking if you're still there. Yes, Netflix. I'm still here. Emotionally unstable but physically present. By the mid-1800s, doctors started reporting something new, insomnia. Not because humans suddenly got more anxious, but because we were fighting against a system that told us, you should fall asleep at 10 p.m. You must wake up at 6 a.m. You should never be awake in the middle of the night. The midnight gap became a problem. Something to be medicated. Smoothed over. What was once sacred became pathological. Let's throw in some sleep aids for fun. The industrial age gave us opiates, laudanum, chlorohydrate, and eventually barbiturates, all designed to make sure you stay asleep all night. Why? Because you have a train to catch at 7 a.m., and your boss will not accept, I was contemplating the Psalms and then got distracted by my wife's warm elbow as an excuse. The sacred became the inconvenient. But let's pause here, because it gets worse. By the 20th century, we weren't just lighting up factories, we were lighting up the world. Electricity, neon signs, fluorescent office lights, televisions, computers, smartphones. Now you're lying in bed at 2 a.m., not reflecting on your eternal soul or whispering with your spouse. No, you're watching a mun named BreadDad42 explain how to make sourdough in a haunted cabin, which is valid, but not exactly spiritually enriching. Sleep became a commodity. Books, pills, mattress brands with names like Cloudwomb and Dreamboink. Sleep became a marketing battlefield. We tell ourselves, if you don't get 8 hours, you're failing. If you wake up at night, you're broken. If you sleep in 2 shifts, you're weird. But guess what? Your ancestors would like a word. Because here's the irony. We think of 2 sleeps as a bizarre medieval quirk. But biologically, it's still inside you. Studies have shown that when modern people are removed from artificial light, say, in a lab with natural darkness only, they begin to naturally sleep in 2 phases. It comes back. Like a memory. Like an old friend. Like a flea-ridden sheepskin blanket, but comforting. So, to summarize this slow collapse of your circadian dignity, pre-industrial people slept in 2 shifts. It was normal. Industrial people needed you alert at dawn. So we invented the 8-hour block. Artificial light, factory work, and time clocks killed the midnight gap. And now we medicate ourselves into unconsciousness just to pretend the old way never existed. Progress. But here's the thing. It's not hopeless. Because more people are rediscovering this lost rhythm. Not just historians, but psychologists, sleep scientists, even insomniacs, who lie awake at 2 a.m. and wonder, why do I feel weirdly? Okay. You're not malfunctioning. You're medieval. You were designed to have a sacred, sleepy little moment in the dead of night. A pause. A break. A breath. It's not a bug. It's a feature. And yes, your boss still needs you at 8 a.m. tomorrow. But maybe, just maybe, next time you wake up at 2 a.m., you'll give yourself permission to lie there. Think. Stretch. Pet the cat. Maybe whisper a little prayer to Saint Dymphna for good sleep and protection from existential dread. And know that for thousands of years, people did the exact same thing. Under the stars. By firelight. With dreams full of saints, bread, and poorly organized crusades. You wake up again. But this time, it's not natural. There's a bell. A long, low, soul-shaking toll that sounds like it's trying to vibrate your sins out of your body. You sit up, blinking. It's still night. Still cold. Your feet are tangled in your scratchy wool blanket. You hear movement. Sandals scraping over stone. Whispered prayers. The faint rustle of robes. Congratulations. You're now living in a medieval monastery. And it's time for matins. Let's talk about monks. If you think you have a strict morning routine, try being a Benedictine in the 12th century. They didn't sleep in. They didn't have weekends. They didn't even have coffee. What they did have was the Liturgy of the Hours, also known as the Divine Office, a rigid schedule of prayer sessions that divided the day and night into holy chunks. And that meant getting up in the middle of the night. Every night. Because when you dedicate your life to God, you don't wait until sunrise to say hello. The midnight prayer session was called matins, later sometimes called vigils. And it was scheduled for, you guessed it, right in the middle of your two sleeps. Monks would be jolted awake by bells or the knock of a fellow monk, because nothing says spiritual enlightenment like being roused from dead sleep by Brother Gerald poking you with a stick. You'd drag yourself out of your wooden bed. If you were lucky, there was a. If you were really lucky, you weren't on the bottom bunk next to Brother Barnabas, who has night farts and a snoring problem. The monastery was cold. Always cold. Stone walls. No heating. Maybe a fire in the main hall, but not in the dormitory. So your first holy act of the day, freezing your soul into a popsicle while you fumbled into your robe. You'd shuffle into the choir, the place in the church where monks sat for long hours. And for the next hour, or sometimes two, you chanted psalms in Latin. No instrumental music. No melodies. Just voices, rising in sacred, monotone waves. If your brain didn't wake up naturally, the droning certainly helped. Or made you more tired. Hard to say. And this wasn't just for show. Monastic life was centered around the idea that prayer must never cease. Not even at 2 a.m. It was a sacred duty. A spiritual alarm clock. You were meant to be always spiritually alert, even when your eyes were crusted shut and your body was begging for sleep. This wasn't sleep interrupted. This was sleep orchestrated. After matins came lauds, another prayer session, often held just before dawn. So yes, many monks essentially had 3 sleep segments. A short nap before matins. A second nap between matins and lauds. A third nap in the grave, because honestly, how do you survive this? It was like God had looked down and said, you shall pray, you shall fast, and you shall never again sleep through the night. Now, were monks always devout during matins? Not exactly. We have records of monks dozing off, sleepwalking through chants, or strategically hiding behind pillars to sneak in a forbidden nap. Because even the most pious among us eventually needs a little REM. Some monasteries tried to keep monks awake by enforcing rules. You couldn't lean on the wall. You couldn't sit down. You couldn't bring a blanket. So if you ever wonder why medieval art depicts saints with such serene expressions, it's probably because they finally got to sleep in. But monasteries weren't the only ones doing midnight worship. In towns and cities, church bells would ring for matins too. So even if you weren't a monk, you might hear the distant clang at 2 a.m., reminding you that someone, somewhere, was praying. It gave structure to the spiritual world. A sense that, even in the darkest hour of night, the divine was active. Awake. Listening. And if you were awake for your own reasons, say, you just finished a romantic moment with your spouse, or you're contemplating your existence after a weird goat dream, you might whisper your own little prayer. Midnight was holy, even for sinners. But let's go back to the monastery. Because monks weren't just holy, they were tired. Some monastic orders, like the Carthusians, took the midnight waking to an entirely new level. They lived in isolation. They didn't just wake up for matins. They woke up multiple times throughout the night, to pray, to read scripture, and then crawl back to sleep for an hour or two before the next prayer. Imagine this as a sleep schedule. 6 p.m., sleep. 11:45 p.m., wake for matins. 1 a.m., sleep. 3 a.m., wake for lauds. 4:30 a.m., sleep. 6 a.m., wake again because the cows need milking or your superior is yelling. We'd call this a sleep disorder today. They called it discipline. Interestingly, this monastic structure might have influenced the broader population. Even peasants and townspeople, who weren't especially religious, were aware of the rhythm. Church bells marked the time. Even if you weren't heading to matins yourself, the sound of the bell might stir you during your midnight wakefulness. You might say a prayer, cross yourself, or just mutter, "God bless the monks. I'm going back to sleep." The divine office set a kind of spiritual beat, a holy metronome, for medieval society. Everyone danced to it, whether they wanted to or not. And here's the part that really blows modern minds. Monks like this system. Many describe the quiet of matins as the most peaceful, meaningful part of the day. No distractions. No conversation. Just the dark, the chant, and a sense of timelessness. They were alone with God, and maybe with Brother Gerald, who still has terrible breath, but mostly with God. The midnight hour became sacred because it was inconvenient. You sacrificed comfort for devotion, which, when you think about it, is kind of the tagline for all of medieval life. So what have we learned? If you're waking up in the middle of the night and feeling strangely calm, you might just be spiritually prepared for matins. Even if you're not in a monastery, even if you have no idea what lauds are, even if your only chanting experience involves Spotify and bad taste. It's not insomnia. It's divine scheduling. Next time you wake at 2 a.m., remember the monks. Remember the bells. Remember that people used to plan their lives around this time, build architecture to echo it, carve time from their sleep to pray during it, and still somehow wake up at dawn to milk something. You, too, contain multitudes, and probably some sleep debt. But you're not alone. You're just very, very historically correct. You wake up again, only this time you're not in a monastery. There's no chanting, no bells, no Brother Gerald with his questionable hygiene. Instead, you're in the middle of a medieval city. It's dark. It smells like damp wood, wet stones, and an undercurrent of urine that has ambitions of becoming historical. Somewhere, a rat sneezes. It's the middle of the night, but the city isn't fully asleep. Not really. Because while most people are nestled into their hay-stuffed mattress lumps, the streets belong to someone else now. Welcome to the world of night watchmen, thieves, bakers, and secrets. The real medieval nightlife. No cocktails, no clubbing. Just shadows, bread ovens, and crime. Let's start with the night watchmen. You probably imagine them as noble guardians of the peace, patrolling cobbled streets with lanterns and halberds, keeping the innocent safe from danger. And that's half right. The other half involves heavy drinking, public sleeping, and questionable hygiene standards. But still, they were necessary. Medieval towns had no streetlights, no police force in the modern sense, and a whole lot of reasons to worry after dark. Fires. Thieves. Drunks. Drunks who start fires. People who aren't drunk but still manage to accidentally start fires because they're using an open flame to find their other candle. So night watchmen were hired, or more often, voluntold, to patrol the streets after curfew. Yes, curfew. That's not just something your parents invented to ruin your teenage years. In medieval cities, curfew was literal. The word comes from couvre-feu, cover fire. At sundown, people were required to extinguish or cover their hearts to prevent fires. The bell would ring. You'd cover the fire. Lock the door. Stay inside. Unless you were the watch, or a criminal, or someone who needed bread. And yes, criminals loved the curfew system. Because once the town is locked up tight and the watchmen are either napping or busy investigating a chicken theft, it's open season for petty crime. The streets are quiet. The houses are dark. Nobody expects a break-in at midnight because, culturally speaking, We're all supposed to be somewhere between first sleep and pious reflection. Thieves knew the schedule. They knew how long people were typically up between first and second sleep. They knew how to sneak through alleys, avoid the watch, and slide into homes through unlocked shutters or poorly constructed doors. In fact, medieval houses were often so rickety that a determined person with two hands and a deep grudge could probably remove a wall panel and crawl in. And what about the people who weren't criminals, but still up and about? Let's talk about bakers. Bread wasn't just food. It was survival. Most medieval people ate bread every single day. Not fancy, crusty, artisanal sourdough, more like a mildly depressing wheat sponge that tasted faintly of ashes and desperation. To have that ready for the morning market or the local lord's table, bakers had to start early. And by early, we mean middle of the night. They'd wake up after their first sleep, stoke the oven, which took hours to heat, knead dough, and begin baking by candlelight. If you were awake around 3 a.m., you might smell the faint, comforting scent of baking bread wafting through the city, which almost makes up for the other smells, like rotting refuse and the fishmonger's leftovers fermenting in the gutter. Almost. Other professions worked the night, too. Tanners, who needed long hours to soak hides in extremely unpleasant vats of water, lye, and animal waste. Fullers, who pounded cloth with their feet in large troughs of stale urine. Midwives, who operated on baby time, not sun time. And innkeepers, who were often awake for travelers arriving at odd hours, or just drunk locals who forgot where their house was again. Night was not dead time. It was inconveniently productive. Now, let's talk about crime again. Because crime, like time, never sleeps. And honestly, nighttime was the golden hour for mischief. Not only were the watchmen frequently unreliable, but law enforcement was incredibly localized. No central police. No forensic science. Just you saw a guy in a hood? Cool. That narrows it down to everyone. The justice system operated on tithings, groups of men who were responsible for each other's behavior. If one of them committed a crime, the whole group had to pay. So if one of your boys went out at 2 a.m. and stabbed a guy over a poorly sung lute song, you were now financially responsible. And speaking of stabbing, let's not forget duels, vendettas, and the occasional ritualized beating between rival guilds, often performed well after sunset and fueled by too much ale and unresolved childhood trauma. Of course, not all nighttime behavior was illegal or economically motivated. Some of it was just deeply human. Midnight was a time for secrets. Illicit lovers, hidden meetings, quiet conversations between people who couldn't speak freely during the day. Even religious figures sometimes snuck out, not for sin necessarily, but for escape. A quiet walk. A moment to breathe. Because life in medieval towns was loud. Daytime was a swirl of commerce, animals, shouting, and clanging metal. The night? Stillness. Space. Introspection. And maybe some quiet sobbing because your mattress is filled with straw and regret. Night was also feared. There was superstition, of course. People believed that demons and spirits were most active in the middle of the night. That witches flew. That souls wandered. That if you heard your name whispered in the dark, you should not answer unless you wanted to die choking on your own sins. The in-between time, between first and second sleep, was often when people had their most vivid dreams. Some called them messages. Others called them tricks of the devil. So, naturally, people tried to protect themselves. Sleeping with a knife under the pillow. Hanging iron charms over the door. Whispering prayers to Saint Michael before drifting off again. Because nothing says good sleep like mortal terror and a pocket knife. And yet, despite the fear, the midnight gap remained useful. A moment of quiet in a chaotic world. If you were poor, it might be the only time you had to think. To dream. To touch your spouse without a child screaming or a pig escaping. If you were a merchant, it was a time to count your coins by candlelight. If you were a scholar or a priest, it was time to write. Some of the most beautiful illuminated manuscripts were made by men who worked by moonlight, adding gold leaf with trembling hands, trying not to sneeze on sacred Latin. So the night wasn't dead time. It was transform time. For work. For love. For mischief. For prayer. For hunger. For thoughts you'd never admit out loud in daylight. 2 sleeps gave people the freedom to do something else, a little moment of autonomy in a world that left very little space for personal agency. It was a crack in the clock. A sliver of stolen time. And even if the watchman were asleep on the job, the city was very much alive. So next time you wake up in the middle of the night and feel like the only person alive, you're not. You're just a few centuries late to the real nightlife. No glow sticks. No DJs. Just the sound of distant hooves, a bread oven heating in the distance, and maybe a thief quietly cursing because he stepped in something wet again. And maybe, just maybe, you'll light a candle and do something quietly rebellious. Like breathe. You wake up again. This time, your head feels like it's stuffed with damp wool and regret. Not from partying with thieves or chanting with monks. No, this is a different kind of medieval headache. You're thinking about why your sleep is broken into 2 shifts. And maybe wondering if it's just some weird historical quirk or if there's a grand, mystical explanation involving humors, demons, or just plain bad luck. Well, buckle up. Because medieval medicine and sleep science is something. First, imagine this, you're a medieval doctor. No microscopes. No caffeine. No studies on circadian rhythms or REM cycles. Just a lot of ancient texts, a few herbal powders that might be poisonous, and a smelly robe. Your job is to explain why people wake up in the middle of the night. And how to fix it. Spoiler alert, the explanations are wild. The prevailing theory was based on humorism. Remember those 4 humors from school? Blood, hot and wet. Phlegm, cold and wet. Yellow bile, hot and dry. Black bile, cold and dry. Doctors believed that health was about balance. Too much or too little of any humor caused illness. And guess what? Sleep was directly linked to humors. If you woke up during the night, it might be because your humors were out of whack. Maybe your blood was boiling too much, causing restless sleep. Or your black bile was too dominant, making you gloomy and anxious at midnight. The cure? A cocktail of strange remedies. A warm bath if you were rich enough. Herbal teas, sometimes with poppy or mandrake, which probably knock you out but might also make you hallucinate. Applying leeches, because why not? Sleeping with certain herbs under your pillow, like lavender or wormwood, because smell was apparently very important for keeping bad spirits away and improving sleep quality. And if none of that worked, well, maybe you needed an exorcism. Speaking of spirits, medieval people often believed that nighttime waking was caused by supernatural forces. Nightmares weren't just bad dreams. They were thought to be visits from incubi or succubi, demonic creatures who sat on your chest, stole your breath, or messed with your mind while you slept. Sound familiar? It's basically the medieval version of sleep paralysis. If you woke up unable to move, gasping for air, and convinced you'd been visited by a demon, you were absolutely right, except your local priest, not a neurologist, was your doctor. And don't forget about environmental factors. Your bed smelled like a farmyard mixed with old cheese. The mattress was straw-stuffed and full of bugs. Your blanket was a rough wool sack, itchy enough to keep you awake by itself. There was no heating. No insulated windows. Just stone walls that sucked every ounce of warmth from your body. If you lived in the city, the streets outside were noisy until curfew, and sometimes even after. People yelled, animals screamed, barrels rolled, and the occasional drunk staggered by singing the latest ode to barley. If you lived in the countryside, you had to worry about wolves, bandits, and the occasional angry neighbor with a pitchfork. So it's no surprise that your sleep was broken. And now, the crowning jewel of medieval sleep science. First sleep and second sleep were considered normal. Doctors didn't see waking in the middle of the night as a problem. They thought it was natural, even healthy, to have this segmented sleep pattern. People used the gap to reflect, pray, have sex, or even visit neighbors for a chat. Because who wants to wait until sunrise for a little human connection? Sleep wasn't some big block of 8 hours like your Fitbit tells you. It was a process, a ritual, a dance with the night. And honestly, we might be the ones who got it wrong. Some modern sleep researchers have looked at historical sleep patterns and found that what we think of as insomnia might just be the echo of this medieval rhythm. The idea that we should sleep straight through the night is a relatively recent invention, made possible by electricity, central heating, and the crushing social pressure to be productive at all hours. Back then, 2 shifts of sleep made sense. Your body woke up naturally. You used the quiet hours for whatever you needed. Then you slept again until sunrise. So what about modern insomnia sufferers? Maybe we're not broken. Maybe we're just stuck in a sleep schedule designed for a world without Netflix, streetlights, and ambient noise-canceling headphones. If you wake up at 2 a.m. and can't get back to sleep, maybe your ancestors were right all along. Sleep is supposed to be segmented. Your problem might be expectations, not biology. That said, medieval medicine did have some practical tips. Avoid eating too much before bed, because an overstuffed belly was thought to disrupt your humors and give you nightmares. Try not to drink too much ale or mead late at night. It might make you pee a lot, interrupting your sleep even more. Keep your room clean, or at least cleaner than a barnyard, to avoid bad smells and pests that disturb sleep. Which, honestly, isn't that different from what modern doctors advise. But for everything else, like demons, incubi, or evil spirits, the cure was often a mix of faith, charm, and good, old-fashioned prayer. If you believed hard enough, it worked. Or at least it gave you something to focus on other than the fact that your straw mattress smells like betrayal. So, the next time you wake up in the middle of the night and can't get back to sleep, remember, you're part of a very old tradition. The tradition of segmented sleep, herbal remedies, spiritual vigilance, and a whole lot of existential anxiety about the dark. And maybe, just maybe, your medieval self is whispering from the shadows. Stop scrolling on your phone and try counting sheep instead. You wake up once again, in the in-between hours. The world is dark, quiet, and pregnant with possibilities, or maybe just a heavy scent of damp straw and last night's ale. You might think this is when everyone was busy counting sheep or just staring into the abyss of the night, waiting for dawn. But you'd be wrong. Because in medieval times, the hours between first and second sleep were the real after-party of the day. You see, night wasn't just for rest. It was also for living. For many, especially in the cramped conditions of medieval towns, night was the only time to sneak out, meet, whisper, and do things that daylight wouldn't allow. Imagine you're a medieval villager. Your day was packed, farming, cooking, cleaning, praying, dealing with the plague, trying not to get trampled by a horse. Daylight was chaos. So when the first sleep ended and the night opened up, you had a chance to step out of the routine. Maybe you tiptoed to a neighbor's house for a secret conversation. Maybe you visited your lover, who lived 2 streets away, because obviously you couldn't get a private moment in the crowded, smelly cottage you both shared with 6 siblings and a chicken coop. This midnight period was also popular for family and community interactions. People would get up, light a candle, and gather around the hearth, not to sleep, but to talk, knit, tell stories, or argue over the best way to patch a roof before the next storm. Since there was no radio, TV, or TikTok, storytelling was king. Tales of saints, demons, brave knights, and terrible plagues filled the night air. And because it was night, when the veil between the natural and supernatural was thought to be thinner, these stories carried an extra weight. They could scare you, teach you, or just distract you from your itchy mattress. For some, the night was a time for quiet rebellion. People hid from their rulers, broke curfew laws, or indulged in forbidden pleasures. Some couples took advantage of the darkness to be intimate, because sex during the day was either forbidden, frowned upon, or interrupted by chores and nosy neighbors. The night was a little freedom in a tightly controlled world. Religious people had their own special reasons to be awake. Monks and nuns often used the gap between first and second sleep for vigils, quiet prayers, or chanting that marked devotion and sacrifice. It was a time for contemplation, repentance, and sometimes a good, old-fashioned existential crisis. Interestingly, some medieval doctors and writers even recommended using the waking hours between sleeps wisely. Don't just lie there staring at the ceiling, they said. Use the time to reflect on your life. Plan your day. Meditate. Pray. Because that's what separates the civilized from the animals. On the other hand, if you were poor and unlucky, those middle-of-the-night hours could be terrifying. Darkness was dangerous. Criminals prowled. Wild animals wandered. Fires started. The waking time was often a chance to stay alert, to keep an eye on your children, your possessions, or your livestock. The night watchmen we met earlier were part of this nocturnal vigilance. The two-sleep pattern also had implications for marriage and social norms. Some historians suggest that this fragmented sleep allowed couples to have more intimate time together, separated by that quiet pause. This might explain why medieval literature and records sometimes describe nights filled with both passion and prayer, sometimes separated by an hour or two of awake reflection. It was like nature's way of forcing you to hit pause before hitting play again. And speaking of nature, no one had central heating. Cold nights made long, continuous sleep almost impossible. You'd fall asleep, wake up freezing, shuffle to the hearth, warm your hands, and maybe chat with whoever else was awake. Then back to bed. The medieval night was a complicated dance of light and dark, noise and silence, fear and comfort. It was a time for humanity, for connection, for secrets whispered in the dark. So, as you slowly drift back into your modern, single-block sleep, no segmented waking, no open fires to cover, no demons to chase away, remember this. The night you're about to fall asleep into is a quiet echo of a very different world. One where waking up in the middle of the night wasn't a problem to be solved, but a moment to be lived.